Genshin Impact 2.8 is right around the corner, and along with it, it is bringing one of the most highly anticipated rerun banners of all time, that being the rerun banner for Kadehara Kazuha. Hi, my name is Blossoms and welcome to another Genshin Impact video, and today we're going to be going over an updated Kazuha build guide, as although he's a relatively simple character to use, he has a lot of complicated mechanics involved in his kit, and if you don't know about him, you might be missing out on how to use him properly, as well as the fact that he has a lot of different viable builds with different main stats, so we're going to be going over all of that, his weapons, some different teams you want to pair him in, as he is one of the most versatile and strong characters in the game, so knowing everything you can be very useful. So yeah, we have a lot to cover, but before we do, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this type of Genshin Impact content. It helps me out a lot and I really appreciate it. So first up, we need to know a little bit about his kit and how it all works, and I think a good place to start is going to be Chihayabaru, his elemental skill. It has a press and hold function, and these fundamentally work the same, where they both pull in enemies and launch Kazuha in the air, giving him the option to do a different plunging attack called Vanzan, and when you do that plunging attack, it deals Anemo damage and it sucks in nearby objects and enemies. Now, the core differences between the press and the hold are, one, of course, damage, so the hold will deal more damage, and it also has a slightly longer cooldown, but it gains the benefit of having a larger AoE, and the Anemo damage it does counts as a heavy instance of Anemo damage, which is very important. It helps shred shields, most importantly, and that helps you out a ton. And while this is great on his own, one of his passives, Soulman Swordsmanship, actually gives Chihayabaru elemental absorption, meaning it can take on Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, or Electro, and deal a little bit of additional damage of whatever element you come into contact with and absorb on your plunge attack Ranzan. It'll be 200% of your attack. And the reason I started with the elemental skill here is because of the normal attacks, they don't really do anything on their own, but leveling them up does contribute to the damage that Ranzan does, which is the plunge that you get from Chihayabaru, so that is pretty important to level up as well, as that is going to be increasing your damage from that. And that does contribute, so you can't necessarily just level up the E skill and ignore the normal attack if you want it to be dealing some really good damage. Kazuha also has access to a really strong elemental burst in the form of Kazuha Slash here. And essentially the way it works is you cast it dealing a big hit of Anemo damage. This hit of Anemo damage also counts as a heavy instance of Anemo damage, by the way, so that's going to be really good against shields as well. And then it periodically deals AoE Anemo damage throughout its duration, and it also has elemental absorption, taking on an element and dealing a portion of damage of that particular element. So yeah, the initial slash is like 472 here you see. At level 10, you get a damage over time here with pretty decent modifier and a little bit of extra damage from whatever you absorb. It has a duration of 8 seconds and a cooldown of 15 seconds, so you do have some downtime, but trying to get this off of cooldown is very important, as the off-field damage that this allows you to maintain is very strong. And I keep mentioning the heavy instances of Anemo damage because I believe that makes Kazuha one of the only characters who does 2 instances of heavy Anemo damage there, meaning he's a shield monster. If you've ever seen Kazuha against the Fatui in the Spiral Abyss, you've probably seen him annihilate them, and that's because he's usually swirling whatever elements they already have going on and dealing heavy instances of Anemo damage against them, which allows him to get rid of those shields super fast and deal a ton of damage to him. Alright, now for the most important part of his kit, and arguably what makes Kazuha one of the strongest characters in the game, and that is his passive talent, Poetics of Fubutsu. And the way it works is whenever you trigger a swirl reaction, meaning your E skill or elemental burst, it will grant all party members a 0.04% elemental damage bonus to the element absorbed by swirl for every point of elemental mastery he has for 8 seconds. Bonuses for different elements obtained through this method can coexist. So yeah, that's right, if you swirl multiple elements, you're going to be getting an elemental damage buff for both of them. This makes him insanely strong for electro charged and freeze comps, but he can also just simultaneously buff 2 elements like Hydro and Pyro for your team, overall increasing the output of damage for the team. And when you combine this with something like viridescent venerer, it makes him insanely strong, because then he'll be debuffing and buffing while dealing incredible swirl damage. And just as a side note, his last passive here actually decreases your sprinting stamina consumption by 20%, which is highly underrated because it just allows you to dodge more and is very, very nice. So not only does Kazuha have really good crowd control via Chihayaburu and awesome mobility because of that, I can actually dodge a ton of attacks because of Chihayaburu. It comes in way more than you might think, but he also has good off-field Anemo damage. He can consistently debuff enemies and also consistently debuff your allies while dealing heavy instances of Anemo damage, allowing you to really shred some shields, and it doesn't even end there. So while all of that is already incredible, Poetics of Fubutsu makes him so insane, not only because it's buffing your allies, but because of the fact that it works off of 1 elemental mastery and 2 swirling. And the reason this is so important is because when you lean into elemental mastery, your swirls are going to be dealing more damage. And for those of you who don't know, the way swirl works, if you're swirling more than 1 enemy, you're actually going to be dealing multiple instances of swirl to both of those enemies. So an example is if I have like Hydro over 1 enemy and I swirl them, I'll get 1 instance of swirl, but if there are 2 enemies, then I swirl both of them, I'll be doing 2 swirls to both of those enemies, essentially doubling your damage. And since he's already really good at crowd controlling, it makes him incredibly strong for this reason, because you're already going to be investing into elemental mastery to buff your characters. And the fact that this works off of any aspect of his kit means that it's always going to be happening and is incredibly strong, not to mention that you're getting these elemental absorptions to allow you to continue to apply these different elements to your enemies. Also wanted to briefly talk about elemental absorption because we keep mentioning elemental absorption here, and his E-skill and elemental burst both do it. If you have all 4 of these elemental absorption elements in one location, well, first of all, congratulations, that's pretty hard to do, but 2, when you swirl or absorb one of them, there's actually going to be a priority to them, and the priority is as follows from most important to least important, that being Pyro, Hydro, Electro, and Cryo. And this is important to know because depending on what team you're using on him, you might want to apply something like Pyro later, since it's going to be the most important thing getting absorbed, and maybe your DPS is a Hydro character or something, so you'd want to apply Hydro first, swirl that, and then do whatever with your Pyro character. So knowing that order can be important for a lot of your different rotations. I also wanted to mention the fact that Chihayaburu can swirl multiple elements, as we mentioned before, and buff multiple elements at the same time, but also oftentimes you might find that when you absorb an element, on the way back down, you might cause a reaction or 2 because of those multiple elements coming down. So it's pretty often that when you're coming back down, you might cause another reaction anyway, and your elemental mastery is going to be helping there too. Artifact sets for Kazuha are luckily very simple because there is just no other 4-piece in the game that is going to be nearly as fantastic as the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer. It increases your Anemo damage and it increases your swirl damage by 60%, and you're already going to be dealing a ton of swirl damage from investing into Elemental Mastery, but now you get to increase that by 60%, and then it also decreases your opponent's elemental resistance to the element infused in the swirl by 40%, and this is the debuff thing I was talking about before, because there is no inherent debuffing in his kit. But when you have Viridescent Venerer, you're debuffing and buffing at the same time, which is just incredible. Now, I do know the pain of farming that domain. Trust me, I spent months getting a single subpar Elemental Mastery goblet, so I definitely understand the pain there, and if you can't get a good 4-piece of it, well, Wanderer's Troop is a pretty good substitute with the 2-piece and a 2-piece of the Emblem of Severed Fate. Those are what I would recommend because it gives you Elemental Mastery, which is always good, and then it gives you some energy recharge, which is actually excellent for him. Getting that burst off a cooldown is super, super important. You can also, of course, pair some 2 pieces of the Viridescent Venerer with either of those 2, that is fine, but realistically, you really do want to climb and grind to get to your 4-piece Viridescent Venerer, as it is just that much better than any split set. Main stats for Kazuha are where things get pretty interesting because there are a few ways people like to generally build him, and depending on how you're going to use him, you might want to use one over the other. And while there's a set that is generally speaking better than the others, depending on how you're using them, that could change for you. But if you want to see a comparison between the type of builds that I'm going to be talking about, I actually have a video on this previously that compares 3 of the more common builds on Kazuha that you guys can check out for yourselves if you guys want to look at that video, give some decent numbers on all those so you can get a visual representation of them to, better decide on which one you'd like to use. But if you just want generally what is going to be the best build on Kazuha and yield the best results, that is simply going to be a full elemental mastery build on Kazuha. This is because this is going to be increasing your swirl damage as much as it can, and increasing your other allies' elemental damage bonus as much as it can, depending on, whatever you swirl because of that one passive. And believe it or not, this generally outpaces a traditionally built main DPS Kazuha, especially when there's more than one enemy, which there generally speaking is, and that's because of that whole swirl mechanic that we talked about previously, where you can get multiple swirl procs on one enemy if there's multiple enemies, effectively doubling your damage, and over time elemental mastery typically yields more damage because of that. But however, although I'm recommending full elemental mastery, if you're not using something like an energy recharge weapon, then you might want to consider something like an energy recharge sands to get that elemental burst off of cooldown as much as possible, because that is very, very important. The damage over time it provides really does add to his overall damage, and getting it off of cooldown, I just cannot stress how important that is. And if you just don't have good enough energy recharge to do that, then an energy recharge sands is going to be good for you. Now, of course, if you have good enough energy recharge substats and are hitting a 170 to 180-ish range, then you're probably going to be fine. And you don't really need to worry about it at that point. But yeah, full elemental mastery and then energy recharge if you need it, or if you're using an energy recharge weapon, then you don't have to worry about it. Now, as for other builds for Kazuha, you can of course build him as a traditional main DPS with attack percent, Anemo damage bonus, and then crit rate and crit damage as much as you can, and that is fine. It actually deals some really solid damage, and if you want to use him that way, then go ahead. And this is actually going to be really good, especially if something like C6 Kazuha, where he's getting free elemental mastery from his other constellations, and now he's dealing a bunch of Anemo damage because he's infused with it because of the C6. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but yeah, if you have something like that, then the main DPS one is something that you might want to consider. There is also another very popular one, that being the hybrid build, and that is where you're typically using something like elemental mastery, attack percent, and then crit rate or crit damage as much as you want. And this is because this is going to, one, still be buffing your allies, but two, something like attack percent not only increases Kazuha's Anemo damage, but it will increase the damage that you do for the elements that you absorb via his E-skill or elemental burst. So a lot of people like to go this way because it allows him to deal more damage while still buffing your allies. And the whole crit rate part of that build, you can even have elemental mastery on that too. You don't necessarily need to be critting, but that is just kind of a form that a lot of people like to go with. And I personally do really like the hybrid build myself. It's still really, really strong. Substats for Kazuha are luckily pretty simple. You're going to want to prioritize first and foremost elemental mastery and energy recharge to make sure you're getting, well, as much swirl and buffing as you can, as well as getting that elemental burst uptime as much as possible. And then after that, I would focus on things like crit rate and crit damage, as those are obviously going to be contributing to your damage. And especially if you're using something like Favonia's sword, which we'll talk about later, then crit rate is going to be pretty important too. And then after those, if you have some attack percent, it's not necessarily bad, but I would prioritize all of those others before it. Weapons for Kazuha are where things get pretty interesting, because there are some what you would think are pretty obvious choices on him that you could use, and well, they are pretty good, but there's a couple choices that are better than a lot of people realize. Of course, there are some obvious choices like his pretty much tailor-made sword, the Freedom Sworn, that is a fantastic option on him. Then there's also the Iron Sting, which is the 4-star craftable weapon that seems pretty tailor-made for him as well, and those are both good options, don't get me wrong. They will absolutely do a great job, but people have kind of realized, myself included, that these two energy recharge options as Sacrificial Sword and Favonia's Sword are actually really, really strong on him, because of the fact that, one, they have a bunch of energy recharge on them. The 55% here is equal to about 11 substats of energy recharge, I think, while things like the Iron Sting are only about 8 or 9 substats of elemental mastery, I believe. And so you're just kind of getting more of those stats, and you could just, have elemental mastery on your substats more so. And these also just provide energy for the team as well, at least Favonia's Sword does. And Sacrificial Sword does a little bit passively, because you get 2 E-skills there, allowing you to generate more particles in general, so your teammates will get a little bit of those particles, residual energy. But the Favonia's Sword is a really strong option because you get those neutral particles going, and are able to generate more energy for your team overall, which is a bigger net positive than just buffing their damage with something like this or using something like Freedom Sworn, because everybody's going to have an easier time getting their elemental burst. So even if you mess up your rotation, or if maybe a character that you have built that you're pairing with Kazuha just doesn't have the energy recharge that you want them at, a lot of these are going to help solve those issues. So I really wouldn't discount these energy recharge options, especially because, well, they're just a lot of fun. Sacrificial Sword is really fun in my opinion. Being able to use his E skill multiple times helps control the crowd even more. It's really strong, and if you have something like his C1 where you're able to use his E skill again, well, that just means you get to do it again, and everybody's just even way more crowd controlled than they were before. Does this increase his field time? Yes, absolutely, but field time for Kazuha isn't really a bad thing because he's already so good. And if you do want to decrease that field time, you can still use the other energy recharge option of Favonius Sword. And there is, of course, the factor into both of these that lower, like very low refinements of these, like 1 or 2 and maybe even 3, aren't necessarily as worth it as I'm saying, because then they're not as likely to actually have their passives go. And then the cooldowns here of like 16 seconds and 6 seconds do matter, because that can factor into his different cooldowns as well, meaning you won't get it to proc as often. So take that with a little bit of grain of salt and realize that although these are fantastic options, and honestly even better options in my opinion, it might be dependent on you, and your artifacts just might not fit these, because maybe you have a ton of energy recharge substats already and this just might be overkill for you. So something like the Iron Sting or Freedom Sworn could be excellent options. Now, of course, if you don't have those options available to you, you do have other options. Things like Festering Desire, or even something like Skyward Blade, or fine energy recharge options. There's also something like the Dark Iron Sword, which has Elemental Mastery substat. There's another 3-star that I just don't have that has an Elemental Mastery substat as well that you can use. Things like the Jade Cutter are actually quite nice, especially if you're going for more of a hybrid build or a DPS build, because then this just gives you a ton of crit rate for free, allowing you to invest in other aspects of this kit to balance out that energy recharge and elemental mastery more effectively. Alright, and finally, let's talk about some constellations for Kazuha and just kind of go over them. His C1 is really strong. It decreases your cooldown by 10%, which is nice, and then when you use his elemental burst, it resets the cooldown of the elemental skill entirely, which is very cool. So you could E-skill elemental burst and then E-skill immediately after, and if you're using something like the Sacrificial Sword like I was talking about before, you could use his skill twice, then use the elemental burst, and then use the skill again, which is just a ton of energy particles coming to you, and that's pretty fun and just a good time overall. His C2 is also very strong. It increases his own elemental mastery by 200 while the elemental burst is up, and it increases the elemental mastery of characters within the field by 200 as well. So not only is he going to be buffing your teammates even more while the elemental burst is up, your teammates are going to be having even bigger elemental reactions while in that elemental burst. So this is an incredible constellation. His C4 really isn't all that important, it's just some extra energy regeneration. It's nothing too crazy, it's just kind of nice in general. And then his C6 is where he really starts to pop off as like a sort of main DPS, because whenever you use his elemental skill or elemental burst, he gains an Anemo infusion for 5 seconds, and additionally each point of his elemental mastery will increase the damage dealt by him by his normal charge and plunging attacks by 0.2%. So yeah, this is where he starts to really pop off on the damage, of course, at C6. And of course that's pretty hard to get, and honestly I don't think this is really all that worth it. I don't think the C4 is really all that worth it. They are nice and okay, but I think something like the C2 is probably the best one, followed by the C1, at least in terms of the opportunity cost of spending that much money to get to the C6. Teams for Kazuha are luckily very flexible, and this is one of the greatest strengths to him, is that he often fits in a ton of different teams no matter what you're trying to do. Now of course he's not going to fit with a lot of Geo characters or anything, but whether you like to vaporize, electro charge, freeze comp, or even some sort of firework comp, he's going to work well in a bunch of those, and a lot of those characters can fit in a lot of those different playstyles for him. He just works in a ton of different teams, and that is one of the greatest things to him. Even though I showed a couple of the different teams that I like to use with Kazuha, you can often swap out a ton of these characters for whoever you like to use to, facilitate your freeze, electro charge, or vaporize, or fireworks combo, and he's likely going to fit in there pretty darn well. That is definitely one of the strongest things about him, that he just kind of crushes most team compositions. There are a couple characters that I wanted to talk about and how they pair with Kazuha, so we'll go ahead and do that. One of the other really good pairings for Kazuha are circle type characters that I like to call them. Basically any character that places down some sort of circle, especially like a different element other than Anemo or Geo. Then that way you'll be able to keep all of those enemies in that circle to do whatever X unit needs to do. Bennett is a fantastic example of this. Bennett is also an amazing pairing with Kazuha, especially because of the fact that Bennett gives so much attack, and since you're not really leaning into attack at all on Kazuha generally, well, that's where you're going to be getting pretty much all of it, so that helps him out a ton. Other characters like Aloy are really interesting for Kazuha because Aloy throws these little mines. Same with a character like Klee, and I'm sure we'll have other characters that do something similar, or even Amber for an example. Basically those little movable projectiles or mines or something that characters do. Kazuha can suck in all of those types of mines or projectiles or whatnot, which makes them a lot better for a lot of the different teams that you could be putting them in. And I also wanted to talk about some elemental mastery boosting characters. Albedo does work with Kazuha. Albedo does have a passive talent where you get 125 elemental mastery to the party whenever he uses burst. However, not every character is like this. Characters like Sucrose actually don't contribute to the elemental damage bonus, or that at least Kazuha gives to the other allies. So if you triggered Sucrose's passive that gives elemental mastery to your allies, and then you go to Kazuha to try and boost your elemental damage bonus, you just get what you would get from your usual elemental mastery and not your boosted elemental mastery off of Sucrose. Now this will contribute to your swirl, but I did want to mention that, and I'm sure there are going to be other characters in the future that help give us elemental mastery, so it's just going to be a, you know, try and test it and make sure that it actually works kind of thing, I'm sure. And I figured I'd point it out to you. In conclusion, Kazuha is an incredible unit that I absolutely love playing. His gameplay is a ton of fun, but other than that, he just has an amazing kit overall that can fit into just so many different teams. His versatility is incredible, and I absolutely love playing him. There is a reason he is still my only Triple Crown character. He won't be for long. I am planning on Triple Crowning some other characters, but I had to get him to Triple Crown immediately because he was just so fun and such a good character. Well, that's going to be about it for today's video. Hopefully this build guide helped you out to build your Kazuha the way you want to. He's one of my favorite characters, and I'm glad a lot of people are finally getting their hands on him, and I wish you all the best of luck on your wishes. But other than that, hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day. I'll see you in the next video. My name's Blossoms. See ya.